This is the history of the Irish in Kansas City, brought to you by the Irish Roots Cafe, part of our series on the Irish in America from www.irishroots.com.
The original immigrants to Kansas City came was at the foot of Grand Avenue.
I'm familiar with the Goats and the Rabbit. Pendergas people were the goat faction. And
the Irish dug the city up from the bluffs.
A few people even thought they saw some old parishioners from the 1800s while they were doing restoration.
Where you're walking was part of the Santa Fe Trail. I'm Michael Laughlin, your host. You can reach me with your comments by emailing mike@irishroots.com or by mailing to Box 7575, Kansas City, Missouri, 64116, the old-fashioned way. Phone in your comments to me at 816-256-3360. Please do call in and leave your message. We always look for comments, and you might be able to help us out with a little audio message of your own, letting people know what some of the history in Kansas City is, and for that matter in the Midwest as we expand our episodes. We've gathered together a group of scholars, authors, and everyday Irish to paint you the picture of the history of the Irish in Kansas City. Today we talk with Michael Burke, Episode 3, from Canada in 1868. The Burke family arrives early. When Ireland met Kansas City. And remember, folks, St. Louis is coming up after our Kansas City episodes are finished, and we're always looking for stories and interviews on the Irish in America. So be sure to get a hold of us if you got one you think's going to work. Take a look at the Irish Roots Cafe page if you get the chance. Find a book, search for your family tree, or even become a member. It all goes to help keep things rolling in the right direction. You can surely get there from here by going to www.irishroots.com. And remember to check the show notes for this show on our blog on our homepage. Still coming up in future episodes, just to keep you informed, we've got the oldest Irish business in North America located right in Kansas City, Irish songs that time forgot, and a special performance by Peter Adams. And author Pat O'Neill will talk with us about our history as well. And those are just a few of the things coming up. And one note on last week's show, a great book on Father Donnelly and Kansas City history is Pioneer Priest by Dalton. And it has been reprinted at least once. The website of the week is kcirish.com, where you can find all kinds of information on Kansas City and the Irish. Now let's get back to it. Here is our interview with Michael Burke, attorney at law with King Hershey and a strong voice in Kansas City government today. Mike met up with us at the cafe just a few days ago. Well, here we are at the Irish Roots Cafe, and we've got a special treat for everybody today. This is part of our special series on the Irish in Kansas City, and I know that people from all around the country and even around the world are going to be listening to this one. We've got a special guest today, and that is Michael Burke. Michael, how are you?
I'm doing great. Doing great.
Well, now, you know, I bumped into you just a couple weeks ago at the Irish Museum and Cultural Center downtown, that new operation they're trying to get going, and we just chatted for a second, and when I heard your family went back all the way to about 1868 or so, I thought, oh, boy, I've got to talk to you. So I'm sure glad you showed up here today. We'll have lunch right after we get done here, so that'll be good. I got Wexford Mike's back there in the kitchen putting something together. Can you tell us a little bit about when your family came or what you might remember from the oldest days?
Well, my family came to Kansas City by way of Canada. They came over from Ireland to a little town called St. Martha's, Quebec, outside of Montreal in the 1830s, and there was a whole generation of the family born in Quebec. And then in the mid-1860s, kind of migrated south. My great-great-grandfather, James Burke, ended up in Kansas City in 1868. And he brought brother down with him, and they had a number of jobs. Worked for the city building the municipal wharf.
Well, I look back on a lot of those old newspapers trying to find Irish names in that era, and the only place I found them was under work crews, road crews, the back-breaking stuff. They weren't anywhere else, except I think Shannon had a shop in Kansas City, Shannon Dry Goods, early on, but you couldn't find much else here.
Well, I would say you run, if you look at the old city directories, they have a lot of Irishmen listed, and occupation is contractor. And I always thought contractor was an Irishman with a strong back and a shovel.
That's exactly what I thought, too. That's where all the names showed up. They had a street crew, and they dug the bluffs down and leveled out the streets here right close to us right now today.
Yeah. The town really took off from there, and about that time, the family started a grocery store.
Where was that?
So it was the southeast corner of what's now Independence Avenue and Forest, which is about where I-35, I-29 comes through over near Columbus Park there.
Okay. About what year was that?
That would be about 1870.
Oh, good.
And according to city directory, there were a number of them lived in the store, and then they moved around the corner to, I think, 717 Troost. Right. And then later migrated around another corner to, I think, 1118 East 8th Street. So they were right in what is Old St. Patrick's Parish.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we're very active in that community.
Well, they probably knew the Flavins then that ran Brown's, and they're now the oldest business in Kansas City and the oldest Irish-owned business. You could have beaten them by a couple of years if you would have just kept the store going.
If we kept that store going, we probably could have. Wasn't it? My grandmother married. She was the daughter of Patrick Keating, and Patrick Keating was this is another early Kansas City family, and probably, from what I can tell, probably a little better off. He was a contractor, and he was one of the original founders of St. Mary's Cemetery.
Oh.
And I know I had my original ancestor came down here that brought his dad down later, whose name was James Burke also, and he came down and I think was buried over where the cathedral was, and then when they started St. Mary's Cemetery, they dug up and moved the caskets from that cemetery over to what was then the new St. Mary's Cemetery. So right on the top of the hill at Old St. Mary's is where most of the Burkes are buried.
Well, so you've got a good tie into the Keatings and the Burkes from early Kansas City. Mm-hmm. And you've held on to the memory. That's good, because after 2-3 generations, that starts to disappear.
It is, and it's interesting. I know took a course in Kansas City history, which I highly recommend to anybody.
Oh, where? Where did you take it?
At UMKC. Professor Bill Worley, who is just a walking encyclopedia of Kansas City history.
I might have to do that. I'd be interested.
And one of the interesting things he's done, which for anybody who's really familiar with Kansas City, is document the migrations within the city, the ethnic neighborhoods.
Oh, that'd be great.
And an area that I've worked in and helped on the revitalization is the old Columbus Park neighborhood, which is best known as the Italian neighborhood.
Right.
I always kid the Italians. I said, my people were here first.
That's right. It's just been forgotten.
That's right.
Sort of like the French that were here before everybody, and they've been forgotten.
That's true. And then as the city moves south, you can almost trace the Irish and Italians and the Jewish neighborhoods.
Right.
A lot of people don't know Menorah Medical Center was started not too far from where we are, and there was a block down on Grand Avenue. It's now a big parking lot across from Bob Jones' shoe outlet. It's
right.
It's nothing but a parking lot right now. It used to be the most densely populated block in Kansas City.
Good gosh, we're looking at it right now, and you wouldn't know it.
It was called McClure Flats, and it was the tenement area for whatever ethnic group happened to be at the bottom of the totem pole at the time.
How did he get the name McClure?
I'm not sure. I assume that's who platted the property.
Right.
And it was probably at one time kind of the outskirts of activity away from downtown. And,
right.
And was cheap housing. Now it's very pricey land.
Well, yeah, that's for sure. There's not even a question about that. What have you maintained any memories of any other stories from the very early days?
Well, just that it had to be an interesting time for the Irish because we were kind of at the bottom of the totem pole.
That's right. Of course, there weren't very many people here at all, so
that's right. No, had other ancestors. One who did the first city directory.
Who is that?
I knew you were going to ask that, and I can tell you he was my grandfather's father-in-law, and I'll think of the name.
Now, how did that get passed down to you?
I just came across that in some of the genealogy research,
right?
And especially if anybody that does early Kansas City history goes to the old city directory.
Right,
and he one of the first city directories he edited, and then I kind of lost track of him, disappeared. I'll think of the guy.
Yeah, yeah. I'll be well. We can always find it by going back to that first directory.
That's right.
That'll be easy enough. I know I read, the parades were still going back in 1870s, and then they stopped. I don't know if that was because of the Know Nothing Party activity in the States a little bit later or not, but they were real big for a while, died out. Everybody forgot they were even here until they started again in modern times when Mike Murphy really catapulted them to fame by promoting it on the radio station. That was sure the beginning of a whole new era where people just started to look back a little bit at their Irish roots here in town.
Well, it was, and I think maybe unknowingly Mike Murphy, tapped into something that people have been wanting to do,
right?
And recognize more actively their Irish heritage, and St. Patrick's Day is a great time of year because it's when you kind of kick off the dust of winter and start into spring. And
that's right. And some people like to get special permission to take off from school.
That's right. And some people even get into the sauce a little bit.
It's happened. That's good and bad. I remember when I was researching back there in the early days when they were writing into the paper, and they said, this is back in the 1800s, and they said, boy, this is terrible. The Irish control the city officials in this town as if they were breadcrumbs at their table, and that this is an outcry for the Swedes, Norwegians, everybody else to unite and overcome this Irish menace. So every time I hear somebody complaining about immigrants, I always have a little bit of temperament in there.
I know, and we still have people afraid of immigrants to this day. So,
well, that's right, and that's how we all started. That's for sure. Now. Did you ever hear any legends about the old Pendergas regime?
Well, that's an interesting part of my family history. My dad was an attorney for over 50 years in Kansas City, and went to Rockhurst College and night school at Kansas City School of Law, which is now UMKC Law School. And he got his master's in tax law. Which was rare then, and he got a call one day, and it was the Friday that Tom Pendergas had been indicted, and he met Pendergas for the first time that day, was present when he was booked, and later was a major part of his life. He handled all the civil end of Pendergas income tax woes. Settled those with the federal government. And then when Pendergas went to prison, my dad was his representative on the 5 companies that Pendergas owned, Ready Mix Concrete.
Oh, Ready Mix, right. They did was that Brush Creek down there?
That's right. They did Brush Creek.
Hey, they made some good product, didn't they?
They did. As they found out when they tried to tear it up
that's right.
50 years later. So they're just a tremendous amount of history during that era. My dad, probably the most interesting story he tells was Pendergas called him one day and said, when you have some time, come by. And he said, I'm thinking of applying for a pardon. And he said, here's a list of 10 names of very prominent Kansas Cityans. And he proceeded over the course of about an hour or 2 hours to tell my dad what he had done for each of those prominent people.
Right.
And he said, I would like you to get a letter of recommendation from each of the 10. And it was a pretty daunting task. My dad, probably the most prominent name and the one that probably had the most to lose was J.C. Nichols.
Oh, right.
And so my dad went to see him and told him what he was there for and said, now you understand, Mr. Nichols, that whatever letter you write may someday become public.
Right.
And Nichols called his secretary in and he says, young man, you dictate whatever letter will do Mr. Pendergas most good.
You know, there's a whole story there that nobody's ever really told. The legacy of Pendergas is just a legacy of the clean sweep with everybody going out on their porch with the brooms, but there's a loyalty there, and there's something that we're missing in that story. What kind of man do you think he was?
Well, my dad all used to describe him in great detail, and he was certainly a product of his times, both in terms of the positive things he did and in the faults. But his office was at 1908 Main on the second floor there, and he held court every morning, and he prided himself on seeing people in the order in which they came in. If you were a United States congressman, but there were 3 people ahead of you, he saw you after he'd seen the other 3.
A little bit of justice in that.
And then along about noon, he would lock the door, and Pendergast, and this was his downfall, was a compulsive gambler on the horse races.
Right, heard he used to come out north.
Right, and he had a wire that got him the racing results from across the country, and he started making bets, and then it became a very compulsive thing, and never successful, and that was what led him to start accepting some of the bribes.
So if he hadn't have gotten into gambling, he could have had a good reputation.
I think so. And you know, the interesting thing is if you look around Kansas City, and we're undergoing quite a building boom right now, which we haven't in about 30 years. And it seems like every 30, 40 years we undergo that type of boom. But the building boom that took place in the 30s under Pendergas included what's now our police headquarters, our city hall, the Jackson County courts, municipal auditorium, all of those, and then a lot of our roadways were extended and paved for the first time in Jackson County.
Boy, I tell you, as a percentage of the budget, that may have never happened since.
Well, and what a lot of people don't realize, that was a model for what later was the WPA. Under Roosevelt,
right?
Because it was creating jobs in the community, and Kansas City, while it suffered through the Depression, probably had a lot more opportunity for construction jobs than any other place in the country during that period. So it was, and without some of the leadership of the Pendergas regime, a lot of that would not have happened, and the ability to garner public funds.
Well, that's right. Well, there had to be a force to get something done, and there's always 2 sides to the force.
There is, and even the most talented people, sometimes there's a fatal flaw, and certainly that was the story of Pendergas, as it was neither all good nor all bad.
Well, that's right. Maybe somebody will come out one day and get the whole picture of that and do a little television program or a special report to get the real story. I think it's time now.
I think so too, and it's what's interesting are the lessons learned from that piece of history.
That's right. Take the best and go with it, and remember what the mistakes were, and don't do it.
That's right.
What about I always ask anybody that talks about the early history and mentions Pendergas, the goats and the rabbits. Are you familiar with the goats and the rabbits?
I'm familiar with the goats and the rabbits, and the Pendergas people were the goat faction, and got that name because a lot of the Irish on the west side, where Pendergas' strength was, the West Bluffs were very steep back then.
Right.
And and there were a lot of shanties there, and people said, "Well, look at those people. They're living on the side of the hill just like goats."
That's right. And a lot of time I heard people say, "Well, they're a bunch of old goats." I think
right.
It was it Shannon who was with the rabbits?
That's right. That's right.
And the Shannon name goes back in Kansas City history quite a while too, and he.
Of course, he went on to a different level of government, didn't he?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. He did.
And that gave Pendergas more room to operate locally at the same time.
It did, and it's interesting when those factions fought against each other. Things slowed down. When they cooperated, a lot of things got done in early Kansas City.
Boy, doesn't that remind you of national politics too?
It does.
If only we could work together a little bit more, just on one or two things, it would sure be different. What others? Can you remember any other stories or facts about early Kansas City that help tell the story?
Well, I think one of my interests, and I've been very involved in, is the Kansas City riverfront.
Right.
And we're getting our riverfront redeveloped, and it's a great asset for Kansas City. But people. Where the original immigrants to Kansas City came was at the foot of Grand Avenue.
Right.
And the reason that was a trailhead that was cut through from Westport to by a very smart merchant named McCoy, who wanted to bypass the Independence outfitters,
right,
and have his own access to the riverboats, and found a natural rock outcropping at the foot of Grand.
That's still there. There's still that rock.
That's still there, and that became the starting point for Kansas City. And the Irish are largely credited with having dug the city up from the bluffs.
Right.
There's an archaeological area between 2nd Street and the riverfront that we call the town of Kansas. And the town of Kansas is prominent because since it was in a lower lying area more prone to flood, a lot of the original buildings, while they don't exist anymore, the foundations of those buildings are still there, and the area was never rebuilt. And we've done some archaeological assessment.
Oh, who?
Actually, the city of Kansas City spearheaded it.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
And it was done by the University of Kansas. And when we have plans, the city of Kansas City has plans for that area to try and make it into an archaeological park.
Oh, I think that would go big.
And it is such a prominent area. If you go down to the city market, what you really need to do, there's a beautiful new bridge, pedestrian bridge that we've built from 2nd and Main,
right,
to the riverfront. And it's kind of a walk past history, because where you're walking was part of the Santa Fe Trail.
Right.
Santa Fe and Oregon trails. And either side of that pedestrian bridge is where that town of Kansas exists.
Well, I remember the first newspaper I found, and it's in the early 1850s, might even be earlier, and it might be 1840s, was started by Robert Vinton Kennedy, and he was upstairs in a building. It might have been on Grand. But the byline in the paper says the town of Kansas, Missouri.
That's right.
Which was Kansas City.
That's right. And,
but hey, is there any way anybody can help give that operation a little boost, the archaeological thing? How would you create some interest?
Well, it's been a little tough, because Kansas City is probably the most difficult city to find history in. It has the richest history. And we've hidden it very carefully.
Yeah, that's true.
I know right now we're even in a dispute over who owns the artifacts of the Kansas City Museum. So,
oh my!
So we're working to remedy that, and what we'd like to do is do a historical exhibit at one of the buildings at 2nd and Main, and then have an active archaeological dig.
I'm ready to sign up
because what was uncovered in the exploratory dig were not gold doubloons and treasures,
right?
Although there were a few coins that turn up, but things of more everyday interest. Whiskey bottles and hair pieces, hair combs, and buttons, but among the buildings that were there were the original town buildings. There was a hotel there that was the Gillis House,
right? That
was acquired by an abolitionist group from Massachusetts, and they funneled settlers there from the East Coast to Kansas in the period preceding the vote on Kansas statehood as to whether it be pro-slave or pro-freedom, pro-abolitionist. And it was there was, and again, it's part of the Santa Fe and Oregon Trails. So a huge cross-section of the history of the westward expansion of this country right through that area.
It's covered up.
It's
covered, and it wouldn't take that much to do it. We've got enough people now coming to you got the Irish Museum folks who might want to help. We've got the city who's interested, and folks like you. I'd really like to see that go. If there's ever anything I can do to help, be sure to pass it on, and we'll spread the word.
Great. Well, we've got a good master plan for how to do it, and it's like everything else. It's a matter of funding and priorities.
Have you ever heard of Joseph Murphy and the Murphy wagon?
Yes.
They said 200,000 of his wagons were made and came across the West, and a majority of those, of course, would have come right through Kansas City, Independence, Westport, and it's really quite a story. I thought he might have a bunch of Irish workers working for him, so I did some research, dug up some old papers, and it said that he tried to hire a bunch of Irish, but they didn't quite work out because they wanted to set their own hours. And so most of the guys that were working, that I found the names, they were German because they had a different kind of work ethic. And I thought, well, boy, I was really disappointed. Now I thought I'd find a treasure trove of early Irish workers, but it was Joseph Murphy himself and not too many other of the Irish there. But that's just part of the story, and these threads are just woven through history, and the Oregon and California Trail is just another story all unto itself.
Well, it certainly is, and I think we can be very proud of the Irish in Kansas City. We've had played a role at every stage of the early development in Kansas City, and I think there's still a lot left to play.
I think that's right, and it's not at times as well documented as you might think. Well, is there any other parting comments you've got to make? We've covered the early days in the 1800s. We've covered archaeological dig into the future. What else is there left?
Well, the only thing I'd just something that's happening currently that is probably of interest to the old Kansas City Irish, and that's the renovation of Old St. Patrick's Church.
Right, and that's been going on a little bit.
That's going on. There's a congregation, the Latin Mass group that Bishop Finn has said if you can help raise the money to renovate it, you can use that as your primary church.
Right.
And it's ongoing. It's a daunting task because that's, like so many other things, a facility that wasn't maintained over the decades and needs a lot of careful work. But
it sure ties into the history. And I heard a few people even thought they saw some old parishioners from the 1800s while they were doing restoration work.
I've heard that story too.
So that might be a little tip-off that we're supposed to do this. They might be pointing the way.
I think so.
Well, I tell you what, Mike, I really enjoyed that. What do they have cooking up for you back there in the kitchen? I don't know what your favorites are, but I think you'll be able to find either a salad or a big steak. I don't know which way.
I think so. It's the difference between what I'm supposed to eat and what I like to eat.
And that's the story of life, isn't it? Well, thanks a lot, Mike. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Bye. This is Mike O'Loughlin at the Irish Roots Cafe. Reach me anytime at irishroots.com, where you can find all of our books and podcasts, including our Irish Families Worldwide podcast. And be sure to check the show notes for this episode on our webpage. Donations and comments are welcome, and a big thank you to all of our members who make this all possible. That's all, folks. Until next time, we meet right here, right where Ireland met Kansas City, at the Irish Roots Cafe.